good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'd also like to welcome our local government members from Victoria and Queensland who have joined us for today's session. Firstly, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands of which we're all meeting and dialing in from today. Pay my respects to the elders past and present. Please feel free to just pop where you're dialing in from in the chat. That would be great. We are going to get straight into it. So I'd like to welcome Sally Thompson. Sally is a project engineer from Blue Mountain City Council. Sally is also one of our great LGEA delegates, and she also sits on our committee of management. How we'll run the session is Sally will go through and do her presentation, and we've got space at the end for comments and questions. But if you do have anything, burning questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we can kind of go through them. So that's everything from me. Sally, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Brooke. I'd like to thank everyone for dialing in. Yeah, I'm Sally Thompson. I do project delivery at Blue Mountain City Council here on Darugland and on Gundungurra land. This always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. And I actually really like to acknowledge country when we're having events like this, because as local government professionals, we now have a responsibility to walk alongside Aboriginal people in the management of the land that we live and work on. And we have the great opportunity to keep our land, sustainably managed into the future. And I really feel honoured to be able to say that. So my presentation, and as you know, as you do a presentation, and what you first need to do is think of really something clever to call it. So I failed the first test. But anyway, my subtitle, How to Avoid Communication Traps as an Engineer, is pretty relevant. So I've divided it into three sections, how we have different communication traps when we're communicating with different groups of people. But I'm just going to launch straight on into how to manage your manager. So one of this is just by being easy to manage. So we have, as engineers, we have a particular way of looking at the world, and we view everything through a very engineering and technical lens. Sometimes we're working for managers who are just like us, and they see things through the same perspective as us. They have the same risk profile as us. They have the same things that they're concerned as us. But sometimes we're working for people who are very different, with a very different background. I've had managers who come from asset management backgrounds, from planning backgrounds. I had a manager who was actually our fleet manager before he kind of stepped in and helped out with the manager when we had a manager leave. And all of these people view things through a really different lens. And so you're building those professional relationships. You need to kind of start understanding and make an effort to understand how they identify and prioritize risk, and how do they want those risks to be managed. So I'm just going to get into some case studies and some examples. And oh my God, we've all been here. Failed subgrade. We have just hit a pocket of little bit of groundwater, and the subgrade that we've designed for this path or this road is just not going to work. So I need to do an alternative subgrade design for about 500 meters of path at a cost of $57,000. Now, this did happen to me. It was on a park upgrade. We put in a really long footpath, pedestrian path on an old golf course, and we hit some very shallow underground groundwater. The site immediately turned into an absolute quagmire, and the contractor kept going in and trying to fix it, but they just kept making it worse. It was so wet. It happened also right at the very start of the La Nina season that we had a few years ago, and the site just was never going to dry out. And so I had to go to my manager and say, we've got problems. We need to do a variation on our design, and it's going to have an impact, a cost impact of $57,000 on my contractor. So Mark is a great person to work with. He's actually not an engineer, but he's a construction professional. He's done a lot of project delivery. He's built wind farms down at Cooma. He has a background in the trades, and he understands the challenges, the technical challenges that we're all facing in these projects. So Mark is going to see things through a very similar lens to us. And he's going to ask a bunch of really obvious questions. And it's really easy to write up a memo for him to approve the contract variation. He needs to know that the work is necessary, that the alternative subgrade design that we'd just come up with, it's going to work. Yeah, we did it at another site. We did it at another site where there was shallow groundwater. It's highly effective, and we've got a 100% chance of moving forward with this, and we're not going to have any failures. This work is value for money. We can afford it. We've checked it against all the rates in our contract, and we've checked it against our budget. Now, Mark was also involved in our tender process. He knows that we came in under budget, and we've got a lot of freeboard there. He knows this is not going to stress the budget. We've looked at other options, and this has been the best solution. And these problems won't cause any other problems, such as a delay. Now, there is extra work in this, but Mark, who thinks like us, he understands there's just a few days worth of work in this. So he kind of already intuitively understands the impact on our timeline. So we don't have to spell that out quite as clearly as we do for other people. And this is also compliant with our approvals. Do we have DA? Do we have a Part 5? He's already all over that. So he knows. Very easy to get Mark to sign off on that contract variation. But what happens if Mark's gone on holidays? Somebody's had to step in as an acting manager, but they're not an engineer like us. They're a great person, they're a really good manager, but they come from a completely different background. So Helen comes from like a project management governance background. She's worked in a project management office. I'm sure some of you all have project management offices at your councils these days. It's a new way of managing a lot of the governance issues that come with our grant funded programs. And they deal with all of the issues with our funding bodies and reporting requirements. They make our life a lot easier because we can get on with the technical work. But often people like that don't come from that construction background, and they don't necessarily see things through the same risk lens that we do. So Helen's going to have a whole bunch of questions that she's going to ask. Now, some of these questions are the same, and some of them are quite different, and some of them she needs to be spelled out in quite a lot of detail. So Helen, I need a contract variation. It's $57,000. I have determined that the alternative subgrade design is necessary because the path can't be moved. Because sometimes people will think that you can just move a path. These things cause a lot of challenges. So if you think you can just pick up and move a piece of civil infrastructure. So often we can't do things like that, but it's not obvious to people who are not like us. And so be kind when they kind of ask some of those questions. The alternative design will solve all of our construction difficulties. The cost of the variation is a fair and reasonable price for the work. Now, Helen, of course, wasn't involved in our tender process, so I'm spelling it out for her. We've got a budget contingency of $112, and we can afford the $57,000 variation. The appropriate forms have been completed. She wants to make sure that we haven't compromised our tender thresholds. We haven't compromised our council resolution that approved this tender. We spell those things out for her because those are the questions that somebody from a governance background is going to ask. It's also not obvious to her how much additional time and work this variation is. So spell it out. It's going to be an extra 4 days. This is probably going to blow out our deadline by only a week. And so she needs to understand that because she feels more confident moving forward if she can talk to our director through some of these things as we're moving forward. So I've just got to get a bit of water because I already did this presentation this morning to my cat and as practice. So forgive me. And moving on, here is another example. Now, this is actually something that I had to do on a active transport project. We ended up putting in a section of boardwalk that had a bit of a fall. And where our standard railing is the ball and post that you see at the top, we ended up looking at the safety implications where there was a fall from height, and we decided to put in a cycling safety rail, as you can see on the bottom. These things are quite different, but they are a specialist cyclist safety issue because you can see where that top rail bends over, and it's like a shoulder bump bar. What this does is it stops the cyclists from their handlebars or their pedals getting caught up in those vertical posts, because that can completely flip a rider who's riding at speed, and that can cause some quite serious, it makes an accident quite a lot more dangerous. But again, oh, it's a variation that I need of $57,000. I'm going to have to get this justified too. Oh, my new acting manager, Sharon. So Sharon comes from a different background. Sharon comes from a bit of a compliance background. She might have been a bit of a building inspector or in the planning kind of function in the past. She's always about the rules and the regulation and whether or not we've compromised any of our requirements. So I kind of need to keep this in mind when I'm writing a memo for her to approve this. So I need a variation for $57,000. What does Sharon need to know? Does this add value to the infrastructure by making it more safe? And we can say that, yes, we absolutely can. We've looked at the safety issues of this fall from height. We've looked at how busy this path is going to be with cyclists. There's a school down the road, kids are riding to school. We consulted with our cycling advocacy group, and they are really in favour of this change to the project. Can we afford it? Yes, we definitely have a budget contingency of $75,000. This is a big chunk of it, but we can absolutely afford this safety improvement. Will this change cause other problems, such as delay? Well, you probably need to have gotten in touch with all the providers, and you need to understand what the lead time is for some of these items, because sometimes they do need to be specially fabricated, and that can actually have a pretty serious impact on our timelines, especially if it's been identified late. Spell that right out, because Sharon needs to be able to answer those questions to the director. Will members of the public complain about this change? Now, that's a pretty tough one. I'm going to go back a second. I can almost guarantee that there's somebody who hates the colour red, and they are going to complain about the safety rail being a colour red. And they'll tell us it needs to recede into the landscape. It needs to be less obtrusive. Of course, you know, our response needs to probably be, it's a safety railing. It needs to be highly visible. Maybe that's not great for people with colour blindness, and we could think about that a little bit more. But often these things are they're very different. People aren't used to seeing these in some of our communities, and they will look at it and think it's a completely ridiculous type of railing. So, and do we need to do additional consultation? Do you need to go back onto your communications portal? Maybe some of your councils have a community consultation portal on your website where all these types of updates to projects are actually kind of communicated to the community. You may need to do another workshop or send a formal notification through to the cycling advocacy group to let them know that you have made this change. Maybe you need to go to the principal of that local school down the road and let him know that there's going to be a change to this project. Maybe Sharon's got some other compliance concerns. Do these safety rails technically make the carriageway a little bit narrower than it has to be? If you've got a grant condition where you need to provide a 2.2 metre wide path for this very busy active transport route, does that take 20 centimetres off the width of the path? Make sure you've got answers to those types of questions, because sometimes, especially when managers come and step in, my experience is they'll often kind of work on a rule of three. When they're being faced with a request on something they don't know and they have no background on, they almost feel like they have to come back to you with three questions. Sometimes you can't predict what they are, but you can do a pretty good job. And I find the more things you predict, the more easy the answers are for the questions they do answer. Oh, now here is my bad example. This is actually an example of somewhere where I got caught up because I didn't communicate things well enough to my director. We had to do a flood consultancy, a grant-funded project through the flood grants program, and we do those. Some of you may be involved in the floodplain study and the floodplain risk management study and plan projects that your councils do. And what we decided to do for this one was go with LGP. We typically we haven't really used LGP a lot at my council. I think we should use it more. I think it's actually a really good service, but we weren't familiar with it when I was making this proposal to my director. One of the things about the LGP framework is that councils can actually choose the conditions of contract that we include in the final contract with our providers. So here is something, this is straight out of LGP kind of manuals. You can use council's own consultancy agreements. Some councils may have some conditions of contract that they've written up themselves, or they've got a corporate lawyer to write them up. We can also use the LGP standard contract. That's LGP 1208-4 in this particular case. Or we can use an Australian standard contract, the typical AS 4122 for consultancies. I put this through my director. Dear Kabir, please approve the procurement plan for the floodplain study. And I attached the procurement plan and I didn't hear back from him. And I kept kind of maybe following up. Have you looked at the procurement plan? And he wasn't answering me. And finally, he kind of came back and said, I don't understand what's happening in this procurement plan. I don't understand why you're proposing to use two sets of conditions of contract for this consultancy, because it was kind of hard to explain how we were working with LGP on this particular job. And so my understanding, and I may actually even have it wrong, but this is where we need to kind of maybe work with some of our colleagues. You probably have a procurement specialist at your council. You may even have in-house legal counsel, or you may have, some local lawyers who are on retainers. My understanding is that when you use LGP for a tender process, you're actually tendering, the tender process is managed by the LGP contract, the 1208-4. But when you actually form a final contract, you can elect to use the Australian standard contract for that final contract document. And that was never quite clear in how I communicated that with the director. And it caused me kind of several days delay because it was an easy question, but he also didn't quite know how to ask it. And he kept thinking he'd missed something. So he'd go back and read it again. And the question didn't come through to me. So that was kind of one where I kind of dropped the ball a little bit with the director, who has a particular kind of legal framework through which he views these things. So, and I'm just moving on. This is our second part of my presentation. This is how do we work with our other colleagues, but they're not engineers. When we're in local government, we have a huge amount of interconnectedness of everything we do interacts and has impacts on other parts of the organisation. My first example, which I'm just going to move straight on with, is one of my previous projects. We built a dog park on an old golf course. It was a really big park upgrade, but this is the biggest number of internal stakeholders that I've ever had on a project. It was huge, working across the organisation, working with all these people, getting them on board. So, we had an old golf course. We were building a fenced dog off-leash area, which is actually the second biggest fenced dog off-leash area in the country. We were building 1.8 kilometres worth of walking track along the fairways and through some of the bushland. We were putting in a dog agility area. We're putting in a lot of park furniture. We put in a nature play space with rocks and big logs for kids to climb and clamber over. It was a really exciting project. But the number of people I had to work with through different parts of this project was really big. So I had our open space team. They're the asset owners and operators. They're the mowing crews who go out and maintain it and do all their inspections. The site was right on top of a local creek, so it was right next to a natural waterway. I had to work with the environment team to get our environmental approvals and make sure that we had some really good bush regeneration outcomes on that site. We had a cemetery right next door. I had to work with the cemeteries team to solve some minor drainage issues. And you just give them a call, you call them up and they don't know you, but you don't know them. And so you just make a meeting. Which cemetery are you at the moment? So then you jump in the car and you drive down to Wentworth Falls and have a chat, and you can usually work things out really easily with those guys. I had to work with the compliance team. So our rangers, we had to enforce there's a whole lot of rules that we needed to enforce on this park around the Companion Animal Act, managing bad behavior on site. So the rangers needed to have final say on to make sure that all the signage we installed was actually enforceable, allowing them to enforce these laws on the site. We needed to talk to trades. So we put in a lot of street furniture, and they needed to make sure that they had the capacity to do repairs if they were needed. Our community team. So I worked with our aged and disability officer. She has a really unique perspective on things. She has really great outreaches into the disability community here in the Blue Mountains. And the contribution she made to this project has opened that site up to so many more people that usually don't have the opportunity to head out into natural areas, to head out and enjoy the bushland. From that 1.8 kilometre footpath, about 1.1 kilometres worth of it is fully wheelchair accessible, with really good 1 in 20 grades, and it's really easy for them to get around. We put in enough street furniture for people who need to have a rest as they walk around. So elderly people, or people with a chronic illness, or people recovering from an operation. So they can walk a short period and then have a rest, walk another short period and have a rest. I've seen quite a lot of people out there always using the site in all these new ways that they couldn't use it in the past. And I had our comms team. This was the dog park that everybody hated until it was finished. So we had huge fallout on social media. We had so many councillor complaints. We had complaints to the state member. We had complaints to the New South Wales Environment Minister. I did mention the La Nina weather conditions we were working in. It was very, very challenging on site, this particular project. And they worked with me to manage so much of that fallout. They made my life really easy, but working with them was one of the things that kind of saved me on this job. Okay, and another group I had to communicate with was the garbage truck drivers. So I know that communication and consultation was done with these people, with Kevin's team, at the very start of the project in the design phase. I didn't do the design phase. I came in when the design was already complete. So Kevin had been consulted, and he's been shown these plans, and they said, how many bins do you need? Are these locations suitable? And Kevin's just looked at it and gone, oh yeah, I can access those bins. Thanks very much. That's fine. I went back to him during construction and kind of went, I've got a few red flags around these bin locations. And so I went back to him when we were kind of in construction and kind of did it again, but I spelled it out for him really, really easily. So, hi, Kevin. The new dog park is going to open soon. We have new litter bins that needed to be added to your collection route. These bins are 140 litres inside a bin enclosure. You can see the bin enclosure there. And the trucks will park at the end of the lane. So you can actually see right at the very top of my little map, the end of the lane is right at the top of that dark line coming in there. This dark line coming through the park is actually a footpath. It's asphalt, but it's not a trafficable road. And it certainly isn't a garbage truck trafficable road. But this wasn't clear to him when he was shown the plans in the first instance. I said drivers will have to collect the bins on the edge of the footpath 50 metres and 100 metres inside the site. So I've really spelled it out for him. I've actually given him the full context of what it is that he needs to actually do. So he came back to me and said, thanks, Sal. This is no good. I can't do this. The bins need to be on the road. 140 litre bins are too small for this site. We already pick up 240 litre bins multiple times a week, and the bin enclosures are only used in town centres. So that's where we ended up with, and I had to install these types of bin holders with 240-litre bins, because that was the volume of garbage that we actually had to pick up. Now, I kind of also want to kind of just point out, this is not garbage truck drivers being a bit lazy. One of our worst lost time injuries that we've had in the last few years was actually one of our litter bin collection drivers who was picking up bins in the upper mountains in the middle of winter, and they slipped on the icy ground and they did some really serious damage to their shoulder. So we do need to make sure that these bins are in appropriately safe locations, and that the input from the garbage truck drivers is actually included in this. Another example we had on a different project was we did an entire architectural design for a public toilet, and we were ready to get approval on our construction certificate. And then somebody said, let's show these designs to the cleaners. And the cleaners said, we can't even clean this building. Why are you using these materials? We actually had to go and do an entire redesign from the inside of a building, because nobody had thought to consult with our cleaning team about how they clean the floors, how they clean the toilets, what they need to access, how much space they need, whether they needed any storage, and what type of hose fittings they need to hose out the floor in a public toilet in a park. So it's really good to make sure your communications and all your stakeholders are identified and spoken to really, really early. And moving on to the next bit, here is our community consultation. And yes, I should have inverted commas around that title there, because that is something that a member of the public did say to me. So just moving on, consultation can be a very interesting kind of process, and it's not always the same. So we've got projects where we know that we have compulsory consultation requirements. Of course, flood studies is at the top of my list, because I used to manage some flood studies. The flood manual from the New South Wales government very clearly spells out exactly what we need to do when we are doing community consultation on a flood study. We also have requirements in things like the Local Government Act or the planning legislation around plans of management, master plans, public exhibitions, and how those things need to be managed. Those are actually fairly easy, because we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and it's very clear what our expectations are. But then, just because it's not compulsory doesn't mean we choose not to do it in all other occasions. So all other occasions and all other projects. So we kind of have options around consultation for other types of projects. So here we go, you've got a park, you're going to do an upgrade. You already did a plan of management, so you've done your consultation, but now you're actually doing the upgrade 3 years later, and you're coming into the design process. It's pretty important to kind of do some consultation with the community in those circumstances. Plans of management are usually very broad, overarching kind of frameworks, and they often have a list of a whole bunch of things that are permissible. And then you pick and choose as you move into the future which ones you're going to do on any particular occasion. Things like information gathering for a transport plan, understanding how people move around our cities, where are your destinations. That's how you prioritize your active transport links that you'll proceed with or submit a grant application for in the next round of grants. So optional community consultation is often really, really important. It's not something that I recommend that you flippantly opt out of. Okay. So some of the challenges that we have in the very broad range of projects that we do in local government, might be things like work in public spaces. People have very strong ownership over our public spaces, and people use those public spaces in really different ways. So actually understanding how people use those spaces is really important. If you've got projects that kind of pile on top of each other in the same precinct, or a single project that has a really long delivery timeline, that's a really important thing to note. In one of our town centres several years ago, we were reconstructing a footpath. we were reconstructing a car park, and we were constructing a roundabout at one of the major intersections. These things were deliberately kind of done at the same time to minimize the impact on the community. But it still lasted months. It had a really big impact on a lot of our local businesses. And a lot of our smaller local businesses don't have online kind of options that they can easily opt into. And it was very, very challenging for a lot of our businesses for several months who were very, very upset. We needed to communicate with them very regularly to let them know if there was any delays, any changes to the designs, because we had a lot of very angry people. You often have multiple stakeholders who have different needs. I'll go into that in a minute. And where you've got something that's the first change in a really long time, in the Blue Mountains here, we've got a lot of heritage precincts. We have a lot of heritage spaces, and we do need to look after that. And we also have our environmentally sensitive sites. We have a very well-informed community when it comes to environmental issues here in the Blue Mountains, and it's always a mistake if you underestimate how much they know and care about the environment. So we can't make assumptions about what the community wants or needs. So moving on to my dog park that, as I call it, the dog park that everybody hates. Everybody hated this dog park until we finished it, and now everybody loves it. But here are your puppies. These dogs have really different needs. And so to actually communicate and actually consult with the community, it's really important that you reach out beyond the existing user group of the precinct that you're working in. So there's people who didn't visit that dog park because it wasn't suitable for their tiny little elderly Maltese Terrier. There were people who wanted to do dog training or dog agility training. There wasn't anything for those people. And so the people who have the dogs that run and the dogs that are well behaved, they considered that to be their park, and they did not care about what other dog owners wanted or needed in this space. To actually manage that, what we don't do in the Blue Mountains anymore, we don't have 1 hour community meetings, because in a 1 hour community meeting, it's very, very easy for those single interest groups to kind of take over the whole space and talk for that entire hour about what they want, which is what they already have, because they didn't want anything to change. What happens is that Mabel, who has a tiny little white crusty-eyed dog, she doesn't get a say. The person who's got a dog that they'd love to train to perform in sheep trials, and they don't get a say because there's just no space for them to talk. We have like 3 to 4 hour workshops in a public space, and those single interest groups, they can't take over 4 hours worth of time. They get very tired. And it's amazing how after you've let those people have their go, they've knocked the wind out of themselves and they leave, and somebody comes up to you and says, I really think this is a really great project. I can't wait to come down here with my wife in her wheelchair and actually be able to take her for a walk on the golf course and through the bush. It's going to be so nice. I'm really looking forward to it. And so people will come forward if you give them the space to talk. And that's how you get the whole perspective of the community. Active transports. I don't know if you're in the same space as Blue Mountains. We have so many active transport projects at the moment. We've got a lot of funding through the Western Sydney infrastructure grants, and it's a mistake to only go out and communicate with the cycling advocacy groups. People have a lot of different reasons for riding a bike, and people use their bikes to travel and engage in recreation or engage in sport in very different ways. An active transport link is very well going to help this lady ride to work safely. It's also going to help Dad there, help his kids to learn how to ride the bike. The guy in the middle, hell or high water, he does not like that path. He can't go 80 kilometers on that path and go past all the trucks. He wants to ride on the road. He's a road cyclist. And so this is where you need to make sure you get that whole perspective from all of those different riders. And you are not going to build any kind of active transport link that will get the road riders onto the path. They ride their bikes in a very different way. So it's important to make sure that all of these different groups are catered for in our infrastructure if we can. Yeah, here's another example. These people ride bikes for completely different reasons as well. So we did just build a pump track here in the Blue Mountains and we're very excited about it. The kids love it. So I hope you're getting one of those in your area as well. Okay, on to the community consult. Now, so this is our walking track. It's on that golf course where we built the dog off-leash area. And these are some things that people actually said to me. You don't need a walking track because people with wheelchairs don't even come here. They said that with their full chest. No, of course they don't walk around on a bumpy, lumpy old golfing fairway because there's no path. And you can't expect dogs to walk on asphalt because they'll burn their feet. It's an entire golf course. You can go anywhere you want. It's open space. So there was this bizarre expectation that we were going to force people to walk on an asphalt path in summer. And it was, I don't know where these things come from, but these are the people who are very loud. And so, yeah, making space for all the other people to speak is so important in those community events that you have. So, and this is something that probably is getting onto a whole nother presentation, which is your community consultation versus your external stakeholder engagement. And what is the difference and how do you deal with these groups differently? So back onto our active transport links. We have a cycling advocacy group here in the Blue Mountains, and they're very keen to make sure that cycling opportunities are really investigated and put out there as much as possible. We have a lot of people. We have a big road biking community. We have also a lot of people who care about the environment and climate emissions, and they're always thinking about, how they can ride their bike around instead of taking their car. We are trying to make it as safe as possible for kids to ride their bikes to school. But you don't want to kind of miss all those groups by only consulting with that cycling advocacy group because you don't capture everybody. If you were doing the dog off-leash area, you don't just consult with the dog training school and their clients. So I'm all about these recreation projects, as you can tell, but you do need to go through a process of identifying your external stakeholders. In the play spaces that I'm upgrading at the moment, we have quite a few parks that have a childcare centre or a school right nearby. So we're reaching out to those groups as key external stakeholders. So we make sure that those needs get addressed as well as the wider community. And then there's just another final slide, which is just a little bit of food for thought. First Nations consultation, it's vitally important. Is this classed as community consultation or stakeholder engagement? I very strongly feel that this is actually a stakeholder engagement, and you do need to work with with the committees of our local Aboriginal people a lot. It's a very complex process. I'd love to do a presentation on this too, but we need to find an Aboriginal person to do it with me. And you do need to identify very early if you've got places of Aboriginal significance that you need to manage. And you do need to make sure that these people have time to actually engage. We have in my community 2 First Nations groups that we have to consult with. Communicating with the committees is generally pretty easy, but often the wider Aboriginal community isn't involved in those committees, but there's still a really important need to reach out to those people. So that's just something to think about. How do you work effectively with those communities? They're incredibly busy. They have a lot of requests for support, like for their involvement in projects over and over. So it's really important to make sure that's identified super early as well. And that's actually my last slide. So I might stop the share.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sally. Now we have time, so if there's any questions for Sally, please either post them in the chat or you feel free to turn your microphone on and ask away.
I'm really nervous with all of those names on the screen. There's so many people.
Ah! Oh no, it's very good. It's a very interesting topic. So thank you so much. Well, we don't really, we'll just give it a couple more minutes. So whilst we just see if anyone's got any questions, I just have a little announcement. I just wanted to remind our New South Wales members that we're kicking off our state award campaign on Monday. So we're due to commence negotiations of the next local government state award, start early next year. So we're doing our preparations now. So keep an eye out for comms that will come out on Monday about that. But that is all from me. So if there is no questions, we're happy to wrap up early or anything. I'll just give it a minute.
Okay, I did 12:42. I did okay.
You did really good, so yes, really,
We've actually
really.
got time to eat now.
I know. Perfect, perfect, perfect. Oh, let's see.
Oh, thank you, Ramesh.
Thanks, Ramesh. All right, look, no questions, so all good. I will be posting the recording of this webinar on our member portal. So that will be going up in the next couple of days for if you want to jump back and re-listen to anything else. And I'm sure Sally will be happy for us to share the slides around if anyone's interested. Let us know. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining.